Welcome to Rick on Life, brought to you by the Liberty Beacon Media Project. I'm your host, Rick Amitin, and this is where we talk about impacting others by impacting ourselves. And today we're going to be discussing revolution by transformation with Ford Taylor. After obtaining a business management degree from the Texas A&M University, Ford started his own apparel company named CC Creations. With just a few small investors, he grew the business into a $300 million operation. Ford later left his position as CEO to develop other companies through consulting. Because of market demands, he founded FSH Strategic Consultants Incorporated. He also launched the Ministry of Transformation to unify leaders to impact their local communities. Ford created TL On Demand and travels the world, helping individuals, institutions, and organizations transform themselves by addressing and removing personal and professional constraints. Ford is also co-author of the book, The Hike, and Ford is well known and loved for his passion to transform people's lives. Ford, you're a great friend. Thanks for taking the time to be with us, and welcome.
Oh, Rick, thank you. It's an honor to be with you, and thank you for what you're doing. I mean, the book that you've written, in a world that is lacking fathers, the courage, the humility in which you did it. Thank you for that. You're a blessing.
Man, thank you. I appreciate you reading the book and endorsing the book. And it meant a lot to me that, that you found the book valuable. But hey, you just got back from a little trip. It looked like you had some fun time with your wife. How'd that go for you?
It went great. We got to spend some time in Mallorca, Spain. And if you look at my face, you'll see the difference in my wife and me. She came back with this beautiful bronze tan, and I came back with a red face. So that's the difference in us. But we had a great, relaxing time. So thank you for asking.
Yeah, some of the pictures look like you were having a blast over there. And I'm glad. I'm happy that you had some time like that. We all need that, man. And that was great, that you got a break.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Well, look, just take a moment here and so that people can get to know you and share a little bit of your incredible story with us.
Okay. Well, Rick, you shared just a little bit of it in the introduction. And, I went to school at Texas A&M, and I met Sandra there, and I was a senior when she was a freshman. So I decided to stay in College Station because her bucket list was to graduate from A&M, and we got married when she was a junior. But when she graduated in 1982, I was managing a sporting goods store there local to Texas A&M, and we'd gotten a phone call a couple months earlier from the bank saying they were going to close down the screen printer who printed the numbers and names and stuff on the uniforms that we sold through the sporting goods store, and that we needed to find another screen printer. And I said, okay. Well, a couple of days later, they called back and said, hey, by any chance, would you like to try to take over the ownership of this company and bail it out? And, when you're 25 years old, you've never heard the term due diligence. I said, sure, why not? Mm-hmm. And if I'd known about business what I know now, if I'd known that then, there's no way I would have done that. But we were blessed and thankful. And on paper, we had a very successful business. For 9 years, it grew very quickly. A lot of our local competition was struggling because of the principles and things we were using. It was working well. I got a call for some venture capitalists who said, hey, we like your strategy. We'd like to buy a part of your company. You stay and run it, and let's use our money and grow it much faster. And so I found myself in a position that I really never cared to be in, as the CEO of a publicly traded company. So on paper, our lives looked great. And part of it was I had a beautiful wife, had 3 beautiful daughters, who now, those 3, one is 27 years old and, as you know, newly engaged and lives in New York City. Another one is 24 and lives in Indianapolis. And our 22-year-old is returning this evening, actually, from a 45-day trip in Europe. So we're excited to see her when she gets home. But, in that rise to what some people would call the top, We had a lot of successes, but some pretty big failures. And one of the biggest failures for me was during that season. I spent a number of years cheating on my wife. I did something that I said I would never do, and then I started realizing that what's so sad about it, Rick, is I actually got to a point of pride and arrogance that I thought there was nothing wrong with it. And so here I am running a company on pure moral integrity, doing everything the right way, company's a success, and in my private life, the gap was just huge. And because of that gap, I don't think it was ever diagnosed this way, but basically had a mental breakdown, but sat with a loaded gun, wanted to kill myself, didn't believe that there was ever any chance of forgiveness for what I had done. But thank goodness my wife loved me, and I'll just say straight up, by the grace of God, she basically saved my life. She handed me a piece of paper on a Friday, and she said, "Honey, I know you're not in good shape, and I've called a psychiatrist, and I want you to go see him, and they've agreed to meet you on Saturday because I know you won't take the time during the week." And I went on that Saturday, and slowly my life started getting turned around. And when it did, I started feeling a call, a leading in my life to do it differently. And so I partnered up with a guy, and we did some consulting, and then God, I think, really got a hold of me and said, "I want you to do it for me, not for you." And so then started doing this thing called transformational leadership, and in the process, really started learning to apply the information that I applied in business and on other people to apply it to my own life. And as I did, my marriage turned around. As I told you, my wife forgave me. I started looking deep into why would a man who had a great father, because so many people don't, and a great mother, why would a man that had that fall to that kind of behavior? And then realized I had to deal with the sexual abuse. I had to go back, because if I weren't going to deal with the sexual abuse by that female school teacher as a young child, that my behavior probably wouldn't change. And as I started dealing with those deep inner, those pains, those things that brought so much hurt and shame and guilt and fear that if anybody found out, that no one would ever listen to me again. But I had to start dealing with those. And once I dealt with those, I was freed up to move out and do what I do now. So.
Yeah, and you make it sound like the transition was easy, but from personal experience, and I share my journey in my book. It's not easy. It takes a lot of courage to become vulnerable, honest, transparent. And we all know that if we hide things, it has torment and can make us sick and fearful and immobilized. And so being willing to talk about these difficult things, in our lives, it is very, very challenging. And yet it's what the world needs more than anything, is people being honest with our human plight and our human condition, and how faith plays such a role in that. So I didn't want to leave people with the impression that you just all of a sudden the things got better and there was no hard work behind the scenes, because it takes a lot of work. And you were a man of faith, during that time. You had a background with church involvement, and which makes I think the connection to dealing with these issues, I think, more strained sometimes.
Yeah, Rick, you've heard some of the things that I teach now, and one of the things I talk about is the gap in who we really are, or who we put ourselves out to be, and who's really in there. So there's one that this thing that I call our ideal self, or who we aspire to be, or who we put ourselves out to be. And then there's this who we really are, and there's this gap. And the bigger the gap, the more stress we have in our lives. And so for me, while I was behaving this way, I was also the spiritual gifts pastor at our church. And so, the gap was huge for me. On paper, on the outside, I was actually called the golden boy, the golden couple. And so we looked something very different than what was happening on the inside. And I knew that if I never closed that gap, what could happen to me, that I wouldn't be here today. I can tell you straight up, I would have taken my own life. But to close that gap, what I say now, it's really simple, but not easy. And so the tools to be able to close the gap, the grace that we've received, how to do it. I went to church my whole life. I've got the 13-year pins that I didn't miss for 13 years in a row. And I heard this message, called the good news of Jesus. But really what I heard was the bad news. I was told over and over again that, you're a sinner and burn in hell. And that's really what I became. That's the person I became, is that person that believed that, that lived in shame, that lived in fear, that lived in guilt. And I really missed the good news. But once I learned the good news and started living on the good news side of that Bible instead of the bad news that I learned in church every Sunday, things changed. But was it easy? Absolutely not. But Rick, a lot of the stuff that I do now, and this, as you talked about transformational leadership, where a lot of it is stuff I've used in my career from the beginning, a lot of it was stuff that was developed as I went through the painful process of restoring the relationship with my wife, of confessing to my 3 daughters. I mean, imagine having to tell your daughters how you almost destroyed your family. And it wasn't your wife's fault. She had nothing to do with it. It was a choice that I made. And so going through that, you can still hear, the pain of having to share that, knowing that it would break their hearts. But they forgave me too. Rick, what I learned in all that is, we're told our whole lives to learn to think outside the box. Think outside the box. Your life will be different. Think outside the box. But I realized that thinking outside the box doesn't hear a training. We read a book and do this. And so we leave that box and it gets uncomfortable. And then we crawl back in. And we go to something else and we get inspired again. And we get outside the box and we get uncomfortable and we crawl back in. And what I learned in this process is I had to change my thinking before I left the box. I had to acknowledge this is going to get uncomfortable. This isn't going to be easy. But when it gets uncomfortable, I'm not going to crawl back in. I'm going to
it's very, it's very difficult. My story as well. And, I was a pastor with some real dysfunction and struggle. And, you can be successful in many areas, but when that private, inner man is not at ease and not at peace and, is disrupted, it keeps resurfacing. And it's like you say, we need to think out of the box, but then we grab on something to survive, jump back in the box, and continue on without really dealing with, the real issues that are driving behavior. And it's not because people are evil or that they're coming from dark places. It's just that they're living in areas of darkness. And when you're sin conscious, you deal with that much differently than when you're God conscious. And I was taught to be sin conscious, and that's what I practice. And so my journey really began with of transforming my own life began as I became, more in tune with the things of God rather than the things that were the elements of religion that I just survived with and didn't really, find true holiness and all of that. And, some people get the idea that it's only the down and out, that have these issues, but it can be people who are up and out. You were saying, on the surface, everything looked great for you. Mm-hmm. But, behind the scenes in your private world was mess. And so what we often define as success isn't true success if we don't have a peace of mind. You travel the world, and our country right now is maybe in the most upheaval I've seen in my lifetime. The unrest, the political turmoil, the social dissatisfaction that we're experiencing right now, as well as, the conflicts that are going on in many parts of the world. And I know you travel the world, with your work. And so I'm kind of interested on hearing your take about what you see going on and what we're experiencing, as a nation.
Yeah. Yeah, Rick, I believe that we have a leadership crisis in our country, actually in our world. But we have a leadership crisis. It's not just in our government. It's in our business. It's in our classroom. It's in our churches. It's in our homes as moms and dads. And I believe the center point of that crisis, and I don't judge anybody for it because I was that person. So I'm okay. I mean, there's no judgment here. But I think at the center of that crisis is that as leaders, and of course, my definition of leadership, one of them is if you have influence with one person, that makes you a leader. So we're all leaders at some level. And I talk about organizations being two or more people being in relationship. And so whether it's a family or a nation, right, it's an organization. And I think that at the centerpiece of this crisis is that we as people, we as leaders, we've come to a place where we care more about how people see us or what they think of us or how we look than we do about those who follow us. And if we don't fix that problem, the leadership crisis is not going to go away. And we'll just break it down, for example, families. And I'll just give that example because I don't want people to think it's just the government that I'm talking about. It's all the way through. And so when I help families, and maybe the husband or the wife has done what I've done, and they're trying to reconcile their marriage, but they struggle with, once they reconcile, they struggle with anybody else finding out. They struggle with even telling their children. And I say to them, do you care more about yourself than you do your children? Because, my daughter's recently engaged and I'm doing the premarital counseling with them, and they both know my whole story. And one of the things I want them both to know is if they're ever tempted the way I was tempted, and I made them commit it. I made them give me their solemn oath, and it'll be a covenant at their wedding. But if they are ever tempted, they promise me that they will call me and tell me when that emotional spark comes up with someone else before they go down that road. And see, because I care more about my children than I do how my children see me. And if I care more about the people I work with than I do what they think about me, then there's nothing I'm not going to share with them. Even if it's dirty, if it's dark, if it's ugly, if it's something that's going to help them. And I think that's where our leadership crisis is. And if we don't get to where we care more about others than we do how they see, than we do caring about how they see us, then the lies will continue, the corruption will continue, the racism will continue, the divorce rate will continue. But it's systemic. But anyway, I believe that's the root of the problem.
Yeah, from my storyline that, I think that fatherlessness is a huge problem. And we think of it only in the nuclear sense, the biological parents, involved and so on. But there's a huge gap here between taking accountability out of just a decent practice to something that is absolutely essential. And, authority has a much higher position when it's authentic and genuine, and not just to, for some secondary ulterior motive,
Right.
Transformation. Let's talk a little bit about transformation. Oftentimes a word comes up, there's a general understanding, everybody's kind of on the same page. And then, after it goes through different segments and different groups, you get down the road a little bit and you find the transformation doesn't have, in the same intention that it was designed with. And I think transformation is one of those words that you're not real sure anymore when you're talking about transformation, what that really means. And I know you have a very solid way of looking at that. Share with us transformation.
Okay. Well, when we first started doing, or when I first started doing this thing called transformational leadership, it is a program and it does work. But when we first started, people saw it as something that worked, but as a class, a training, a teaching, and equipping. Well, over the last 15 years, that word has become a genre. It's not, and because it's become a genre, it's hard to want to go to something called transformational leadership or transformational living or transformational finance because it's used so much. Transform your house, transform your face,
right?
Get new ears,
right?
And so because of that, it's really shifted. And so a few years ago, we almost changed the name of our training because of that. But a lot of people said to us, "No, you're too far down the road. Don't change it. Just stay the course." Because the word itself comes from the Greek word metamorpho, which means metamorphosis, which means change. And so the word transformation merely means changing from something that we are to something else. And so I had one transformation 20-something years ago that changed from a pretty good spiritual foundation to someone who cheated on his wife. But that was a change, and it was a transformation. It was just the wrong direction. Right. And so the kind of transformation I'm talking about is the starting point of where we are now. Who is the man that I've become, and who is the man that I'm becoming? And so the transformation that we're talking about is becoming something different than we are today. And we're talking about becoming someone, let's just go ahead and go there because it's all in your book, okay? And for example, the leadership crisis in the church, okay, or in the mosque or the synagogues. One of them, I believe, is that pastors have come to a place, and there's no judgment here because I was one, okay, that they care more about how their congregation sees them than they do about their congregation. And there's no judgment in that comment. But based on that, we spent the last couple of thousand years making Christians and very little time making disciples. And so when I talk about transformation, I'm talking about making disciples, making followers of Christ, and of Jesus. And so Paul says, only follow me as I follow Jesus. And so when we're talking about transformation, we're talking about becoming more like Jesus. Peace, patience, hope, and joy, long-suffering, goodness, faithfulness, self-control, meekness, humility, unconditional mercy, grace, forgiveness. And that leads us to a place with the Father of power, authority, honor, glory. And so we're very specific. But what we're really talking about, Rick, is what you're talking about, is that one of the biggest problems I believe we have is that because we spent so long caring about other people, how they see us, we're not being transparent and vulnerable, so we're not making disciples. But if we can make disciples that have had a true transformation, they'll move to another place. And that other place is what we're talking about. And we're talking about transforming them into mothers and fathers, spiritual mothers and fathers, because we can't all be physical mothers and fathers of the world, but we can be spiritual mothers and fathers. And what's the difference? The difference is if you're a parent and you're listening to this show, then there's nothing that your children can do that would cause you not to love them and cause you not to forgive them. You know that. And if we can find that place as people, as Christians, with other people, then we can fill a void of mothers and fathers that's so huge out there. And what that would mean is that any of the young men or women that I mentor or disciple or father, that there's nothing in the world that they would be afraid to tell me. I tell people, I know stuff about my girls that no man wants to know. But you know what? I'd rather know than not know. And so, but a mother or father, they're not going to be judgmental. They're going to be loving. They're going to be forgiving, but they're also not going to enable. They're not going to enable people to stay in the muck they're in. They're going to help them get a transformation out of the muck by not enabling, but there's no judgment in it. No matter what the past is, no matter what they did yesterday or this morning, we're going to love and we're going to forgive and show mercy and grace as a father would or a mother would to their own children, because that's how we're going to fix this problem, right?
Yeah, and one of the more more amazing aspects of what you do. And, people may not realize that there is quite a active movement right now to take these principles to the corporate environment. And, you're not just talking about Christians and churches, although you work with them. You work with Fortune 500 companies. You work with larger institutions, and these principles, have been lost in the corporate mentality, and yet there is now an openness to actually look at true, transformation, even on the business side of things.
Yeah, Rick, you're right on. I mean, even some government offices, I mean, and even in other parts of the world, in places, there are, equal or more corruption than we have. And they're even more open to it. They're asking me to speak in other countries on corruption and racism and how to fix it. And you're right, inside of companies, there is a big move in the marketplace around the world, and specifically in America, around getting these principles. And so, as you know, the way we go about it is we call it transformational leadership, but we go into these corporations or classrooms or wherever we are at universities, and we give them these foundational biblical kingdom principles, but we give them to them in a way that we call plain glass. In other words, we don't put the scripture to them. But they're truths. It's like oxygen. It's like gravity. If you don't believe oxygen exists, try not breathing for about 9 minutes and see what happens. If you don't believe gravity is real, go to the top of a 10-story building and jump, and you'll know it's a principle that you can't start, you can't stop, but it's real. And so much of these principles that we're teaching, that's the way they are. They're kingdom principles. We didn't make them up. They work simply by implementing them because God put them in place. And so we give them to a way, as you said, in corporate America or other places. In other countries, we have lots of Muslims, atheists, Buddhists that come into our training, and a lot of them find Jesus because they can't deny the truth of the principles that we teach, even before we tell them where they come from. But there is an openness. There's a big openness. And if people try biblical principles, even if they don't believe Jesus is the Son of God, if they try them and they watch them work, they become very open to something that they haven't been open to. And the key, as you said a while ago, Rick, having been a pastor, it's not the norm, at least that I know of. I haven't found it. There are places, but it's not the norm to go to church and get the practical application of how to run your company, of how to be a husband or wife, of how to be a parent. We get the theory. We get told about the love. We get told to be vulnerable and transparent and walk in humility. But we don't get the practical, okay, how do you do that? How do you serve your employees by teaching, training, and equipping them? How do you lay your life down? How do you do discipline? How do you resolve conflict? So we get the theory, but not the practical application. So we try to give people the practical application of the most beautiful theory in the world, and that's the grace of Jesus.
Yeah, a lot of people, I think, are turned off. They think that they're turned off with God, but really what they're turned off with is religion and its presentation of who God is. And it's a hard thing to admit, that I was raised in church, around church. I mean, I had a very tough beginning and some problem in my, early years, before I made a solid commitment to faith and started pursuing ministry, finding, a considerable amount, a respectable amount of success in that. And yet, there were always these nagging things in me that were associated with my religious practice. And there was a disconnect between me and the deeper levels of connecting with God as a Father. And I had to hit bottom, unfortunately, and I had to just about destroyed my life and my wife and my family and ministry and business and everything else, really. Before I realized that this really wasn't about rules and restrictions and regulations and tenets of faith and dogma and all of that. It was about a real relationship with God. And I don't think the world at large and even business has refused any of that. I just think that it's been so camouflaged that they couldn't see that there was the potential in the things of God for the world. And whether it's all the way down to ourselves as individuals and our families, or whether it's as CEOs of large corporations. And so I think there's this move now back toward the divine principles that are not so camouflaged by all the trappings that go with religion.
Yeah, absolutely, Rick. I deal with this a lot inside of companies. When the light bulb comes on for them, well, hold it. You're really telling us about the gospel. I mean, I don't say it, but the light bulb comes on because there are people in the room. And regularly I hear, well, I now realize I'm not mad at God. I'm mad at religion. Just a quick story. I mean, just this last month, I did a training inside of a company, and the ownership of the company, the president, and a lot of the senior team are high faith people, and it's in an industry that's rare that it's high faith, and so we've been working with them for 3 or 4 years, and they brought a new crop of their management through the training, and because I'm dear friends with them, I do this one myself, and one of their young men came up to me at the end of it and said, I've really struggled with something that I've had trouble believing, but I believe you're a person I could hear that from. And so last weekend I met with him in our home, and he was telling me, I've been searching for something my whole adult life, and I think what you brought is what I've been searching for. And after about an hour of the conversation, I looked at him and said, well, do you know where the principles that I teach your company come from? And he kind of looked at me and he goes, I think I may know. And I said, well, where do you think they come from? He said, they come from the teachings of Christ, don't they? I said, they do. And he said, well, you never brought that up. I said, don't have to. I mean, it's obvious. And then I looked at him and said, so tell me where you are. And he went into the pain of growing up in the church and what happened. And by the end, he was saying, you know what, Jesus really is, he's the real deal, isn't he? But see, I would never have gotten that opportunity if I'd gone in with the 4 spiritual laws or with a bunch of rules and regulations or, slapping God or Jesus down their throats. Instead, I just gave them the principles. And Rick, here's where I think here's where it happens. You ready? Research shows that everything you and I are communicating right now with the people we're talking to, that 55% of it approximately is based on our body language, our facial expression, and approximately 38% is based on our tone, how we're saying what we say, and only 7% is the actual words. And so that same research shows that if you're 93% or my 93%, if our behavior and our tone, the way we do it, doesn't line up with what we say, we have little to no credibility. Well, think about us as the body of Christ, that 93% of what we do, okay, is communicated through our collective body language and our collective tone of voice, and only 7% is through our preaching. Only 7% is through our words. And so if we go and we hear the 7%, but the people we're hearing the 7% from, if the body language and the tone doesn't line up with that, and there's no credibility, then they really get to a place where, wow, can Jesus really be true? Because look at the behavior. Look at the way Ford's behaving over there. Look at his body language. Look at the way he talks to people, not what he's saying, but the way he says it. Well, then you lose credibility. But if what you're saying lines up with your behavior, if your lifestyle, if your tone is line, and that's what we call transformation. That now that relationship with the Father, you're no longer picturing bad daddy when you think of God. You know, you're no longer thinking of a bad earthly father or even an absentee father, because you've transitioned past that to who the real father is. And that's transformation.
Yeah, when I discovered who he really was, he was so different than who I thought he was.
Absolutely.
And it changed, it changed everything for me personally. And it's like you say, it's so hard to admit, your moral failures and your breakdowns and things that just they're not. You're told these aren't supposed to happen. If you were right with God, these things were, should never happen. But the reality is there is always a why to what's moving us and what's motivating our behavior. And so you can make excuses and not change. But if you discover why, you open yourself up to true transformation. And you find out that, God, you can't be too messy for God. God's not going to leave you. And he never does. And you find out he was there for every aspect of your life. And so I think this is, just incredible that we can have these kinds of conversations that people can relate to. And, we're not perfect. And but we're not making excuses for ourselves, and we're owning our failures, and we're becoming accountable to the people that are in our life, and that we love, and that we're trying to lead, and the people we're trying to influence. And so accountability is an incredible piece of the components that make up a solid life. So absolutely. What would you say what do you do to help yourself stay in the groove? Do you have any rituals, routines, things that will help you stay in the pocket?
Yeah. Number one, I've learned to read the Bible for what it says and not try to get it to say what I want it to say. So that was a big one for me, is if it says it, I believe it, I move on it. Number two, I realized that so much of what I had learned really wasn't true. Let me give you a quick example, and then I'm going to move to how a practical tool to make this work. Paul at one point at the end of Romans 7 says, I'm this big sinner. Why is it that I can't do what I want to do? And why is it that I do what I don't want to do? And he says it's because I have a sinful nature. But that's the message that gets preached. But someone put a Romans 8 there, and I think the 8 doesn't belong. Because if you remove the 8, Paul then says, so now therefore, there is no condemnation for those who belong to Christ Jesus. For Jesus came to remove, and I went to church, and I heard over and over again, Jesus came to remove the sin. But that isn't what it says. It says Jesus came to remove the power that sin has over you. And when I started realizing that sin has no power in the light, it only has power in the dark.
Right.
And so if I hold my sin in, if I keep it in my mind, then it has power. But if I put it out there, okay, then I'm not walking around in fear of, ooh, what if Rick finds out? What if Sandra finds out? Because it's already out there. And when you already put it out there, it loses its power. And so the concept that we came up with was something that we call bumper buddies or bumper people. Okay. Now the church teaches something called accountability partners. And the reason I think maybe that's not working so well is because we're picking people that can't really hold us accountable. In other words, if I'm the CEO of an organization, I can hold my employees accountable for doing a certain kind of job. If I have a boss, they can hold me accountable. My pastor can hold me accountable to live by the rules of the church or kick me out. My wife can hold me accountable to live the right lifestyle. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about people. It's built on two things, love and trust. In other words, so I have lots of people around me that I call bumper buddies. And so one of them, all of us need people that, what I say is that we see their taillights. In other words, they're our discipler, they're our mentor, because they are further along in some area than I might be. Right. And then we also need people that see our taillights, that we're mentoring, that we're discipling. And then this other large group of people is that we're walking together and we're bumping people back on the road. In other words, they're our guardrail. And it means that they love us enough to tell us if we have lettuce in our teeth. They're not going to let us walk around with pepper in our teeth. If they see that something's off center, They love me enough to tell me. They don't hold on to it. And the second thing is I trust them enough that there's nothing in the world I can't share with them. There's nothing. If I fall to pornography, I don't have to hold on to that. I can tell these men and women this. They're going to love me. They're going to bump me back on it. I can tell my wife now. In other words, because it's completely built on love and trust, and we call them bumper buddies or bumper people. And I don't, for example, Rick, when I travel to a new city or a new country, I don't go alone. I take a bumper buddy with me. And then once I get there, I'll build those relationships in that city or in that country. So the expenses now go down because I can go alone, but I've got those people right there in those cities or countries to walk alongside. So that's my number one tool is people that love and trust, that you can confess your stuff if you need to, because the Bible says confess your sins before man to get prayer, to get healing. And most of us have lost concept of that.
Well, I've seen you even do this in a corporate environment, where you've got a CEO that is, becoming transparent for maybe the first time in his life. And, his whole life, personal life changes, but so does the corporate environment that he's built, because money is not the only, definition of success or the only defining part of success. And so, it's fabulous. I mean, I've gone through your training personally, and over my lifetime, I can't tell you how many seminars and leadership modules and self-help and development and all of these things that I've done for years and years and years. And I've talked to you about this privately, but I think everybody in the world should find a way to go through your training because of the way it's put together and the way it's not, like you say, it's not easy to do it, but it's simple. And if you'll subscribe to that part of what you teach, and these things are all very you can apply them in your daily lives. And see the kind of change and transformation that we are all hungry for. Ford, we're getting to the end. Is there, any parting thoughts or anything you would really want to say before we get off here?
Yeah, Rick, to your audience, if you are a Christian, you are a shepherd. If you're a shepherd, that the definition is you're a minister or you're a pastor. And so the question is, where do you get your vocational income to do that? All right. So wherever you get that income, try to walk a lifestyle that if you say you believe Jesus is the Son of God, walk that lifestyle within that and be courageous. Have the courage to be humble, the humility to be courageous, but let your body language, let your lifestyle show that you believe Jesus is the Son of God. If you have an anger issue, go somewhere and learn how to deal with the anger issue so you don't look angry anymore. Right. I mean, all those little things. Because once you do that, the influence you'll have in every sphere that you live, work, and play in, your influence will go up.
Ford, I know how busy you are, and I can't thank you enough for being with us today and sharing, your story and the work that you do. And I mean, I can tell everybody who's listening to us right now, you have incredible impact with individuals, families, and corporations all around the world. So thank you very much. You can connect with Ford at tlondemand.com. You can pick up a copy of his book, The Hike, from amazon.com. And this is Rick, your host on Rick on Life. Thanks for being with us today. And remember, no matter what's going on in your life, just sprinkle a little love on it. See you next time.